Um, Thank you, Professor Yonai. Thank you, Derek, for that warm introduction. What that introduction sort of neglected was that I'm just a regular guy. I was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas. I did my undergrad at Texas A&M. And I'm a football fan. In case you guys might have heard of this guy named Johnny Football. His real name's Johnny Manziel. And you guys might have heard of this little school in Austin. They're not having such a great season this year, and so. But I appreciate the introduction, and I'm glad to be in front of a group of students who have come to share their Monday evening, part of their Monday evening, with me and with each other, to engage their minds and think about ideas and how ideas matter to the state of the human condition, to human affairs. And so I think that I'll just kind of get more into my usual mode where I'm of teaching, and I probably, if I really wanted to, I would take the tie off, but I'll leave the tie on for now. Let me first just tell you a little bit about what the talk will be. It's based on a book that came out this year. My co-author and my graduate school classmate, Wayne, Leighton, and I. It's called Madmen, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers, the Economic Engine of Political Change. I just have the one copy. I'll circulate it around the room in case anybody gets curious. If you want a copy, I'll send you one. If you're a student, I'll send you one for free. If you're a non-student, I'll price gouge you the way a good profit maximizer should. And I'm also glad, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to pass that around. I'm also glad that Professor Yonai's introduction, at least talking about future programs for y'all, emphasized the importance of institutions. And that is because the book's central question is, what are the forces in society that give shape to institutions, both in political and in economic settings? And so that's what sort of gets us to what the topic of the book is. The main question is, what drives political change? And what we mean by political change is not who's going to win the next election, or which party is going to be in control of the German parliament. The German parliament just had, the German electorate just chose their parliament for the next 4 years. It's not about elections so much. Political change, we mean, is what are the changes to economic and political institutions. And institutions is a way to think about, is a word, the way you can think about it is, it's the rules of the game. What game? The rules of the game for doing politics. And so one of the rules of the game is, what are your requirements for becoming a voter? That's one of the rules of the game. Another set of rules of the game is, how does legislation work its way through a legislative body? Another set of the rules of the game is, how are political campaigns and political parties and interested citizens and citizens groups able to participate in campaigning, in political speech. All of those rules of the game we can call political institutions. And they differ from economic institutions, because economic institutions would be, what are the rules of the economics game? All right. How are income taxes structured on your personal income, on corporate income? What are environmental regulations? What rules of the game do environmental regulations set up? How do we handle resources such as the radio frequency spectrum, through which these little miracles that we carry around in our pockets are used to communicate with each other these days? Those are the types of things that we're preoccupied with in the book. How do those rules of the game get shaped, and how do those rules of the game change? And what it boils out to is we're dealing with two important forces in society. One is the power of ideas, And another is the power of interests. Interests in what? Interests in the current rules of the game. If the current rules of the game are working for you, if you've adapted to those, if you're succeeding under those, then you're very likely to want to maintain those rules of the game. And you'll be a force for the status quo. But if you are a proponent of a different way of doing things, then you're going to want to bring in a different set of ideas. Maybe it's a brand new set of ideas. Maybe it's a set of ideas that's been on the shelf for decades. But if the idea is one whose time has come, you might be a proponent of that, and you say, I want to do something different than the status quo. And if the ideas win, then the institutions change. But if the interests win, then the institutions stay the same. That's the basic setup and the basic thesis of the book. But there's some details that I think you might find interesting and that I think are really important to understand if we're going to have a good handle on the role of institutions in society. So let me give you just a few examples to put a little bit more meat on that bone of what we mean by political change. And so here's a set of examples by decade that have altered the shape of political and economic institutions. In the 1970s, there was widespread deregulation of transportation network industries. It used to be the federal government would set the prices for transportation, airlines, for example, and which routes airlines could fly. Didn't happen anymore after 1978. In the 1980s, there were fundamental changes to personal income taxes. Essentially, those fundamental changes amount to fewer brackets, so that there was less of a graduation of the income tax code, fewer deductions, so that there was less ways to take exemptions and deductions to reduce a person's tax burden, and a lower structure of rates. In the 1990s, I mentioned spectrum license auctions. In 1993, the Federal Communications Commission held its first auction of radio frequency spectrum. And that was one of the reasons why business firms found it worthwhile to bring in massive amounts of investment in the infrastructure, both terrestrial and satellite, for sending signals, and also in the devices. And within a matter of 20 years, we've gone from cell phones, as one of my professors used to say it, only drug dealers had cell phones back in the early 90s. And they were out to here, like big bricks. And they had to, it would weigh them down until now where we have, again, like I said, these little miracles running around in our pockets. Similarly, electricity deregulation in some states, welfare reform, eminent domain in the first decade of the 2000s. And then more recently, we have right to work, 2 states going from closed shop to right to work states. And then also in some major cities, we have some new technologies emerging that are challenging the status quo in taxi cab markets. And that challenge is forcing city councils and taxi cab market regulators to change the rules of the game to accommodate those new technologies. So those are just some examples. We can get into some of these if you want to during Q&A. But I think what I'd like to just impress upon you now is that all of these changes occurred despite the fact that there were vested interests in the status quo prior to the change. And that's interesting because it poses the importance of ideas. All right, so Wayne and I, my co-author and I, we're inspired in terms of the importance of ideas by the giants upon whose shoulders we stand, the giants in economic thought. And so one of those giants is this guy, John Maynard Keynes, whose name might be familiar to you if you've had an economics class or two. But in 1936, he writes the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And at the very, very end of the book, he says, he's sort of almost self-reflective in saying, well, the ideas that I've put forth in this book will they matter? Will they change anything? And he's saying, yeah, I think they will. And he says, because I'm sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared to the power of ideas. Sooner or later, it's ideas that are dangerous for good or evil. That's what Keynes is saying. So in some sense, he's saying, okay, ideas are going to win out, but it's just a matter of time. And in some sense, that's a very rich statement to make, but it's also somewhat simplistic. Are all of those changes are all of these examples just merely a matter of time? I would suggest no, it's way more complex than that. I would suggest that all these changes are the result of multiple parallel processes, some in competition with each other, some reinforcing each other. And that each of them has their own particular unique circumstances that led to the change, but that all of them have something in common. And that's what we're getting at tonight. Right? So Keynes is an inspiration, but I think he leaves some things unanswered. One of the ways to think about what Keynes is leaving unanswered here is to stand on the shoulders of a previous giant. 91 years before Keynes, John Stuart Mill is grappling with the same question. But he says, you know what, ideas on their own, they're very rarely of any consequence. Very rarely. But unless outward circumstances conspire with those ideas, so that when the right idea and the right circumstances come along, that phrase I used earlier, an idea whose time has come, Mill says the effect is seldom slow in manifesting itself. And so this is when we see a little bit more detail put into how ideas have consequences. It takes the right circumstances. And guess what? These circumstances aren't just going to happen on their own. One of the themes that we're developing tonight is that people make those circumstances happen. And that when people do that, they're acting entrepreneurially. Right? So that people make political change happen. And it's not just politicians and wealthy donors to campaign spending. It can be each and every one of us in this room. All right? So that's where we're headed with this. We can create those outward circumstances. So in order to build up that argument, I'm going to do three things tonight. I'm going to say, let's understand outcomes in society as within this structure of ideas, institutions, and incentives. Let's populate that structure with three different types of entrepreneurs, the types that are the namesake of the title of our book. And then three, let's also consider how you and I might matter, the bottom-up flow of ideas. Right? So first of all, the structure of ideas, institutions, and incentives. This is how we can use, this is what we can use to explain the things that we see every day, right? Are we an increasingly prosperous society? Is the youth unemployment rate, which will be the topic for your next meeting with Professor Bollier, is that a situation that's improving or not? What we can do is we can say that answer, that question can be answered by borrowing from Austrian economics, especially Austrian capital theory. Right? Now, F.A. Hayek is another one of these giants whose shoulders we're standing on. And he was an Austrian economist. He was literally an Austrian, but he's also one of the economists for whom the Austrian School of Economics was named. And so in the Austrian School of Economics, we say, look at this bottom part of the pyramid, this triangle here for a second. We say, let's look at consumer goods. Do we have enough to eat? Do we have leisure time? Can we move from place to place in the sense that transportation is cost effective? Can we take vacations? Can we have a healthy diet? Can we have entertainment? Think about the bigger the area of that trapezoid there, the better each of these and many more types of outcomes are. Right? Now, of course, food and transportation and entertainment, they don't emerge out of thin air. It takes investment to create those things. And so Hayek is saying that investment takes the form of capital goods. And it's not just a quantity of capital that matters, but it's the composition of capital itself. The more complex the investment in capital, the more eventual consumer goods value is going to be produced. So if you think about this triangle think about it in the context of agriculture. And maybe think about how agriculture worked in our country 200 years ago. And 200 years ago, agriculture production was mostly labor. In fact, in 1800, 95% of the workforce worked in some way or another in agriculture. 95% of the workforce was making food. There wasn't much left over to make other stuff. And that's because labor was mixed with very little and very rudimentary forms of capital. When tractors came along, when things like disease-resistant seed came along, when global positioning, when GPS came along, and so forth, when all of those investments were made, the pyramid of agricultural production grew. And as a result, the value of agricultural consumption grew. Right? And it was this investment in more and more varied forms, more and more abstract forms of capital that made that happen. So that today, about 1% of the US workforce is employed in some way in agriculture. And meanwhile, the output of agriculture is several dozen times more than it was 200 years ago. Now, the words here on the vertical are helpful, because what the Austrians are saying is that when an economy can engage in more roundabout forms of production, right? Whoever was thinking about how to make the seed more disease resistant, whoever was thinking about how to apply global position GPS to agriculture, whoever was thinking about using tractors instead of livestock in agriculture, they weren't necessarily at the point of the family table. They weren't operating at the point of the family table. They were operating at a more roundabout level. And that's very key to understanding how political change happens as well. So what I'll do is I'll say we're going to adapt this economic theory to the setting of political change. And we have this next slide here that gets that across. So similar to the structure of economic production, in this figure, if you focus on the bottom trapezoid, we'll say, how prosperous of a society are we? How just of a society are we? How much of the things that we view as virtuous and good, how good is the society? Right? So think about that bottom trapezoid as, if it gets bigger, all of those things that we value, that are valuable in life, are getting better. And those depend on what types of incentives that economic and political actors have. If the incentive structure is for politicians to engage in corruption and bribery, and therefore that's what they do, then we're not going to have good outcomes in society. If the incentive structure is instead for politicians to engage in things that genuinely do serve the public interest, then that's, that bottom part of the pyramid will be bigger. Similarly, if the incentives for economic agents are to engage in roundabout production, for example, then we'll have better outcomes. Now, where do those incentives come from? The incentives come one step up, economics and political institutions. One way to define institutions is that's the structure of people's incentives. The rules of the game give people the incentive for how to play the game. And those institutions, in turn, we're going to say depend on ideas. So ideas influence institutions. Institutions shape incentives. Incentives are the proximate cause for the outcomes that we observe. Now, I'm thinking, I know that that's possibly comes to you as somewhat abstract. So I want to tell you a story to sort of bring it alive a little bit. All right. Who knows who Danny Biasone is? Who knows the name Danny Biasone? I didn't think anybody would raise their hand, which is why I asked the question. Danny Biasone was born in Italy, and he immigrated to the United States right after World War II. And he settled in Syracuse, New York. And he was an entrepreneur, and he opened a bowling alley. And I suppose bowling was pretty big in Syracuse because he got very wealthy off of this bowling. Now you might ask, okay, so that's a little bit about Danny Biasone, but what's this Italian entrepreneur who moved to Syracuse have to do with political change? What's he have to do with this understanding this pyramid here? Well, here we have to talk about something a little bit closer to home, and that is basketball. Right? Now, I'm old enough to remember what 1982 was like. The music was pretty simplistic, the fashion was over the top, and the basketball was pretty bad. And let me tell you why. It wasn't because the talent was bad. Michael Jordan played for Carolina in the 1981-82 season. It was because the rules of the game were bad. So in 1982, the ACC championship was held in Greensboro, as it often is. And it was a matchup between Carolina, which was ranked number 1, and Virginia, which was ranked number 3 in the country. And if you look at the rosters, you'll see that it was just filled with talent. Jordan, for example. But there were 4 other folks, 5 total, who would go on to become all-stars in the NBA. This court was full of talent. And back in those days, college games were not televised nationally very often, but this one was. And so it was a rare national TV audience. 16,000 plus were packed in the Greensboro Coliseum. It was a rematch of the 2 games that the 2 teams split in the regular season. I mean, it was a seriously hyped game. It was like what they might call the game of the century. And everybody was looking forward to it. But guess what? As I said, basketball was bad, right? By the end of the game, all of those 16,000 folks in the stadium were booing. And when the final buzzer went off, both teams, players on both teams, left the court with their heads hanging. And the coaches were criticized. Criticized for what? Criticized why? Well, with 7.5 minutes to go, and Carolina up by 19-17, what did the legendary coach Dean Smith tell his team to do? He said, play keep away. He said, play the 4 corners offense. He said, if we can keep the ball and not let Virginia have the ball, then there's no way for Virginia to score any more points. And that's what they did. And for 7.5 minutes of the game, there were no shots taken. There were no points scored. And you didn't see the game of basketball happen. You saw the game of keep away happen. And so that's why the fans booed. And that's why the players left dejected. And that's why the coaches were criticized. There was this Washington Post sports writer. He said, imagine Shakespeare's Hamlet. If the final act was, how did he put it? He said, imagine Shakespeare's Hamlet. If the final act was, I think he said, imagine, I forget what he said about the Shakespeare's Hamlet one, but he said, the second thing he said was imagine Hemingway's classics if their last chapters were written in Pig Latin. You have a masterpiece here, a game of the century, and it was ruined because, as the sports writer said, coaches were thinking too much, and they weren't playing the game. They weren't playing the game because they didn't have the right incentives. What was part of the incentive structure that they were missing? Danny Biassone's big idea. He invented the shot clock. In 1948, he bought the Syracuse Nationals, which was a team that would go on to become an NBA team and play in the NBA. And the NBA had their own situation going on with stall ball. And so like one game, the Minnesota team beat the Cleveland team by 17-16. Nobody wants to pay to see that. And Danny Biassone got it. He said, "My investment's at risk. We got to think about something else." He took his envelope, he turned it over. He said, "Average scoring, number of minutes, number of seconds in a game equals, average number of shots taken divided into number of seconds in the game equals 24." He proposed the idea of a 24-second shot clock to the Rules Committee of the NBA. They adopted it in 1954. In the following season, so a shot clock, if the team holds on to the ball and the shot clock runs out, you have to turn the ball over. Dean Smith wouldn't have been able to play keep away. If the shot clock were there, he would have turned the ball over to Virginia. And the NBA scoring went up in the next year by 15% and ushered in its modern era. The NCAA adopts the shot clock around the mid-'80s, and by 1989, the game had become so popular, the game had become so valuable, CBS comes along and says, "NCAA, we want to pay you for the rights to broadcast the March Madness tournament. We want to pay you $1 billion for that. And in fact, that was 1989. In fact, 6 years later, they upped the ante to $6 billion. And college basketball, which was terrible in 1982, became one of the biggest revenue sports in U.S. Economic history. Because the rules of the game changed to give people better incentives, the outcomes improved. And that's a good way to understand what's going on in this pyramid. So the second point is to pair that structure of incentives, ideas, institutions, and incentives with the people that matter in politics. Madmen, intellectuals, and academic scribblers. Who are these folks? Well, they're political entrepreneurs, as I've mentioned once or twice. And again, we come back to John Maynard Keynes as an inspiration. Here's a passage that comes just before the passage that I quoted earlier. And he basically says, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority, who hear voices in the air, are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. So he's telling us there are some characters to think about. Who are the madmen in authority? Well, they're these folks. And many others like them. Right? Presidents, heads of government, speakers of legislatures and parliaments, executives at the state and provincial levels, governors, for example, county commissions, and so forth. Why are they madmen in authority? Well, they're the folks whose actions determine whether we go from a non-spectrum auction situation to a spectrum auction situation. They're the ones whose actions determine whether whether Indiana and Michigan go from a closed shop to a right-to-work state. They're the ones whose actions determine the rules of the game. They're the ones with their hands on the levers of the rule of the game. In the NCAA story, the NCAA Rules Committee were the equivalent of the madmen in authority. They have their hands on the levers of the rules of the game. Madmen in authority. Madmen in authority engage in the flow of ideas in society. They make speeches, they campaign, they justify their agendas for change. But according to Keynes, they're not the originators of those ideas. They're the inheritors of those ideas. They're not creating the agenda. They're reacting to what the agenda already is. The decision has been made previously. They're reacting to that outward circumstance that John Stuart Mill reminds us about. If the madmen in authority are not originating ideas, would it maybe be the intellectuals who originate ideas? Think about the image that you get with the word intellectual. You might think of a professor. You might think of someone writing a novel in a coffee shop, wearing a turtleneck. You might think of a tweed jacket with elbow patches on it, right? Well, I want to suggest that the meaning that is in the title of our book for intellectuals is similar to that, but it's actually distinct from that. The meaning is that intellectuals are traders in ideas. They exchange in ideas in society. They're not the originators or the inheritors, but they're almost like middlemen of ideas, working between the originators and the inheritors of it. And so, coming back to Hayek wrote an essay in 1949 called The Intellectuals and Socialism. And in this essay, Hayek is saying this very thing, that they're middlemen. He calls them second-hand dealers in ideas. And he says that they play an important role in society, not because they hang out in coffee shops and wear turtlenecks and write novels, and not because they wear tweed jackets with patches on their elbows, but instead they play an important role in society because it's ordinary folks who get their ideas from intellectuals. And Hayek makes a pretty strong claim here. He says it's only because of the intellectuals. There's little that the ordinary man of today learns about events or ideas, except through the medium of these intellectuals. And so those are the folks who think about what might be some examples of these middlemen and ideas, both in Hayek's time and in ours. An easy one would be people who write newspaper articles. Right? Some other ones would be people on this screen here. Take the top left there. Does anybody recognize who that is? Who is that? George Will. And George Will writes 2.5 columns a week on public affairs, and he's been doing that for 30 years. And George Will is your quintessential intellectual because he has the capacity to go into a library and pull off the shelf a treatise on political history, or a treatise on the interface between biology and psychology, or technical economics work, and he can understand that. He can work in that realm. But his real gift is taking those ideas at the abstract level, working on them in his own sort of workshop, if you will, translating them, amplifying them to broad audiences in his column every 2.5 times a week. He takes ideas, he translates and amplifies them in a particular way. These other folks are doing it in similar ways. Right in here in the middle, these are 2 examples of public policy research organizations, think tanks. And they do the same thing. They take academic research, they package it for broad audiences, and they send it out to the media and to legislatures and so forth. These folks are TV personalities engaged in either political reporting or political satire. And they're doing the same thing. They're serving as middlemen of ideas, and they're influencing, maybe not as strongly as Hayek suggested. They might not be the only influence, but they are influencing what ordinary folks think about what's going on in politics. Now, those are fairly easy to sort of think about, but these next ones, they're sort of less directly related in our minds. We don't directly associate them with politics. The bottom left there, do you recognize that photograph? Have you seen it before? It's an iconic photograph taken by a woman named Dorothea Lange during the Great Depression in the Central Valley in California, where everybody had moved from Oklahoma in search of work and then couldn't find it and found themselves in destitute situations. This, for lots of people who view the photograph, is a way of encapsulating the history of the Great Depression. A family in extreme poverty. Dorothea Lange, a photographer, is an intellectual. Similarly, novelists. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. Similarly, who's this person? Does anybody know who that is? That's a young Steven Spielberg. And Steven Spielberg, he's a force in Hollywood, isn't he? But he's also a force in Washington. And why is that? Think about his movies. Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, Schindler's List. Through this medium of film, he's acting as an intellectual. He's taking history. He's repackaging it and amplifying it to mass audiences. And in doing so, he's having an influence on what those mass audiences think about those relevant histories. Those are the madmen, those are the intellectuals. What about the academic scribblers? I submit to you that this is where the elbow patches come in. Right? The elbow patches come in. Who are the academic scribblers? These guys, dead economists. Well, not all of them are dead. All of the ones on the screen are dead, but not all academic scribblers are dead. This is Karl Marx, Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes, F.A. Hayek. And many scores and dozens and hundreds and thousands of others like them. What do? They originate ideas. They scribble in the library. And if they scribble enough, it turns into a book. And if the book is good enough, it has an influence. For example, it has an influence on intellectuals. It has an influence on how those intellectuals want to repackage and amplify their ideas. And so what you see is there's this there's this process. We come back to our pyramid here. There's this process of ideas being generated by academic scribblers and being adopted by intellectuals and being amplified by those intellectuals and being accepted by masses of people, so that the madmen in authority respond when those ideas are accepted by enough people. When the madmen in authority do respond, those ideas are effective at changing institutions. When the institutions change, people's incentives change. And when the incentives change, we see different outcomes, for better or for worse. That's our structure of thinking about how outcomes are determined, populated with the political entrepreneurs that matter. But if you notice, it's very much from the ivory tower down to sort of Main Street and Wall. It's very much top down. And what I'd like to say is that I think that those examples of political change that I showed at the beginning of the talk, they're much richer than just this top-down process. It's not just dead economists having their impact on society in ways that madmen in authority don't even realize. It's also a bottom-up process. Each of those examples, in all of their complexity, has this bottom-up set of elements to it as well. So let's get to the third point here. But it's both top-down and bottom-up flow of ideas. So one way of framing this is to say, if it's bottom-up, then we're talking about coming from the individual level, the small group level, maybe the family or the neighborhood, the community level, up to broader and broader circles of institutional relevance. And so how do those individual beliefs influence the flow of ideas in society so that ideas either become part of our collective beliefs or not? Something that madmen in authority react to or not. I would say there's three important components to that, to understanding that. The first is nature and nurture. The second is creation and innovation. The third is communication. Nature and nurture is who is communicating. Who as an individual is participating in the flow of ideas. Each of us is participating in the flow of ideas by attending a talk on a Monday night. The second part is what is being communicated? What's the content? What is the message? And then the third is going to be what's the medium through which the message is relayed. So nature and nurture. The nature part, it's fairly easy to think about in some sense, but it's also pretty complicated in another sense. We each have one of these. We're each born with one of these. We're each born with a genetic makeup. And some of us have slightly different genetic makeup than others when it comes to beliefs about human affairs. There's a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt at New York University. Recently, he was until recently at University of Virginia. Jonathan Haidt writes about things like some people have genetic makeup that makes them very averse to threats of personal safety. Some people, to put it, to sort of oversimplify and to put it way too colloquially, some people are more scaredy cats than others. And it's what's so interesting about it is not just that observation, but how it matters to people's political beliefs. Others, on the other hand, you can see another distinction to make is some of us fall on one side of being very welcoming of new experiences, of novelty, of variety, and others being very not so much interested in, maybe even afraid of novelty and experiences. And this matters to things like whether we think what we think should be the role of government in producing security, for example, in producing goods for the public, in producing things for the public good, for example. And so part of what's happening here, not to drill down totally into what Professor Haidt and similar researchers are getting at, but part of it of the bottom-up process is that each of us is an individual, and each of us is made a particular way, and that is relevant. Then there's the nurture part. Were you bullied as a kid? What were your experiences as individuals? Were you the bully? Right? Things like experiences exactly like that and very similar to, similar and more broadly than that, can matter to how we grow up and how we think about human affairs. Were we bullied or not? Were we the bully or not? Also, our formative influences in the form of, say, our teachers. In 8th grade, did your teacher encourage you to write a paper on the Japanese political system, or on French philosophy, or on Italian art? And maybe that teacher inspired you to think about that country and to think about different countries in different ways. There's lots of different examples about how your teachers might influence you. And those influences, those nurture influences, come into play as well. It's not just individual experiences that matter, but also shared experiences. If you talk to your grandparents or your great-grandparents, and if they were old enough, they know exactly where they were and what they were doing and how they felt when they got the news about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Right? Just like if you ask your parents or your grandparents, where were you when President Kennedy was assassinated, when the news came out, when Walter Cronkite went on the TV and said, at 1 p.m. Central Time, President Kennedy was pronounced dead. They know exactly where they were and what they were doing. Just like fast forwarding 40 years, each of us knows where we were on 9/11, that fateful day, and what we were doing. And those shared experiences influence the flow of ideas as well. So that's the sort of nature-nurture part. But let's not forget these guys. Oops, excuse me. That's the sort of nature-nurture part. Let's not forget we have to think about not just who is communicating, but what is being communicated. And here I call this creation and innovation because we're going to get into all of the different ways that ideas can be packaged. Literature, film, music, cartoons, poetry. So we have these guys again. Some of the intellectuals, their mediums count in this category as well. And all that means is that these mediums can be thought of as having a top-down influence as well as a bottom-up influence. Right? But there's also these guys, right? Rapper's Delight. Who knows what year the Sugar Hill Gang released Rapper's Delight? 1979. And it ushered in a whole new genre. And part of that genre involves things like, it qualifies as something like protest art. And some of that genre, people in it, like Russell Simmons, they're activists as well as producers and musicians. And so music as a genre counts as well. Who's that? Well, the Sugar Hill Gang is sort of eclipsing him a little bit. Phil Donahue, talk television, talk shows. In the 1970s came out. That was an important medium. Even politics, innovations in the game of politics. William McKinley, presidential campaign of 1896. This was the first presidential campaign where serious money was brought into the game. And his campaign advisor was campaign manager was a guy named Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna was a businessman out of Cleveland, Ohio. And Mark Hanna raised $3.4 million to finance William McKinley's presidential campaign. At that time, it was unheard of, that amount of money to be put into a political race. And it was judged, for sure. But you know what Mark Hanna's response was? He was an innovator in this game. He said, look, to my critics and to my supporters, there's only two things that matter in politics. The first one is money, and I can't remember the second one. Right? So he pushed that envelope in how the medium of politics is played. Right? And of course, we all know these guys. Right? Overt, consistent political satire. All of these things, these creations and innovations, matter to collective beliefs. The medium can also be the message, to borrow that famous phrase. Who's this guy? He was the vice president starting in 1992. When around the time that many of you in the room were born. Right? Al Gore doing his best Steve Jobs look-alike. And why is he doing a Steve Jobs look-alike thing? Of course, because he invented the internet. Right? The internet, as a mode of communication, transformed the way the flow of ideas carries itself out. The way that we as individuals communicate the content that we create. Napster, there's an innovation for you. Again, transforming and putting pressure on political institutions. Which political institutions? The institution of copyright. Because recorded music, if it's protected by copyright, is going to run into conflict with this innovation called Napster. And it did, and there was a fundamentally important Supreme Court case on this. Who's this guy? He's the inventor of another medium, a medium for communicating ideas of education, Sal Khan, Khan Academy. And Khan Academy is exerting influence on education institutions. Campbell University included, my university included. Most universities are having to pay attention to the influence and the power of MOOCs, massive online open courses. Sal Khan is the innovator here. And of course, the world is different now in the way that we communicate with each other because of social networking and because of Web 2.0 and because of mobile web as well. So the medium can be the message as well. And so now what we'll do is we'll take these 3 points and we'll synthesize them. And we'll say, how does the top down and the bottom up interact with each other? And because I'm an economist, I can't let the talk go without using at least one more graph. Okay? And here's the graph. The graph is like an hourglass, if you want to think of it that way. Although I don't see many hourglasses with a big rectangle in the middle of them, I think that we can just kind of run with it and call this an hourglass. And so from the top of the hourglass, you have the ideas of academic scribblers influencing what intellectuals do. Intellectuals, in turn, influencing how people perceive human affairs. But from the bottom up, we have individuals and their hardwiring and their innate characteristics and their individual experiences and their shared experiences at the very bottom of that bottom pyramid. And we have the things that we create. The things that we create that have idea content in them. Everything from music to poetry to fashion to architecture to novels and so forth and so on. And then we have the medium being the message. How are the memes transferred from one of us to another, from small groups of us to large groups, from large groups to larger groups and so forth? How does an internet sensation get created? That's what's happening at the bottom. And so the flow of ideas is both top down and bottom up. And when this flow creates significant changes at the center, at the rectangle part of the hourglass, that in turn is going to affect, when ideas change, what does that affect? It affects institutions, right? Ideas, when they change, it's going to affect institutions. Institutions in turn are going to affect incentives. Incentives in turn are going to change the outcomes that we observe. And it's all about people using ideas and contributing to the flow of ideas in a way that madmen and authority have no alternative but to respond to. And so, do you have to run for office in order to have an influence on political change? Do you have to go get a PhD in economics so that you can write those studies that intellectuals like George Will repackage and write into their columns? Do you have to go work for a think tank? If those are the things that you want to do, that's fine. You're going to have a direct, and I think in terms of the way people think and associate, an obvious impact on political change. But if you want to go and start up a business, if you want to go and work for a large corporation, if you want to go and practice law, if you start up that business and you create value for your consumers, and you hire people and compensate them with the value that you're creating for your consumers, and that's the life that you lead, you're contributing to the flow of ideas from the bottom up. And you're saying that there's integrity in earning a profit because that gives your employees a means for their livelihood and meaning for their lives. you're giving your consumers the value that, that your creations impart to them. And all the other things that you might not think of as obvious interactions with political change. If you are participating in the flow of ideas, you can think about that as having an impact in political change. And so what I'm saying is that we can all be political entrepreneurs, whether it's obvious and direct or subtle and indirect. And we can all do what another famous Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises said. If you want to improve conditions, you must propagate a new mentality, not merely a new institution. We must participate in the world of ideas. So the punchline is, political change happens when people acting as political entrepreneurs notice weak spots, notice weaknesses in the status quo, and implement a different set of ideas into the status quo institutions. Now again, that's kind of putting it abstractly, but it all comes down to, again, Danny Biassone's big idea. Contributing to the way things work, contributing to the rules of the game with a new idea. That's what it's all about. That's what political change comes down to. So thank you. That's the end of my comments, and I'm happy to take questions or whatever you have, take comments from or whatever you have. I'm going to come back to this because I saw some people write.
Okay, the floor is open for any questions.
I answered all of your questions, I guess. There's nothing inquisitive entering your mind because I've covered everything.
So for most of these young people, they're going to end up being either businessmen or women or business leaders. How much of an impact could they individually have on changing the ideas?
This is the direction that Wayne and I are moving in next. This book is somewhat is really academic. It's published by an academic press, Stanford University Press. And the first half of the book is all about laying the groundwork for the analysis that comes in the second half of the book. I shared with you the second half of the book. And that groundwork talks about the history of political philosophy, of Western political theory, from the ancient Greeks forward, all the way to the American progressives, and into the 20th century of economics. And we felt like we had to lay that foundation so that we could, number one, understand exactly, be confident that we're understanding exactly what we're talking about. But also so that we could build on top of that foundation. And what we're building next is we're moving this framework of understanding into something of a sort of prescriptive set of principles that people can follow in terms of answering, getting at Professor Yona's question. How can you make a difference? I think the first thing to say is, don't simply vote and think that you're done with it. If you vote and then you're done with it, that's, I think on the one hand it's inaccurate because you're probably contributing to the flow of ideas in ways that you don't recognize. But on the other hand, it's also a cop-out. And I think that each of us has the capacity, and in a democratic society, also the responsibility to participate more deeply and with greater impact than that. So how? Well, as I was suggesting, if you're in the example of if you run a business and you earn a profit and you compensate your employees from that, you're expressing the idea that there is integrity to earning a profit. You're expressing it to those who observe the way you're conducting yourself. If you join a There are more overt ways of doing it. If you join a civic group, if you contribute to a philanthropic organization, if you participate in civil society programs that bring aid to disaster victims, as opposed to just writing your check for your taxes at the end of the year and saying, FEMA is going to take care of it, I've contributed my share to FEMA. By participating in voluntary associations that bring aid to disaster victims, you're also contributing to society the idea that there's value in doing that. The good thing about the question is that there's a multitude of answers. And that multitude of answers reflects each of us as individuals and the associations we make with each other in civil society. The common characteristic, the bottom line is, participate in civil society, participate with voluntary associations, and perceive the life that you choose, whether it's obviously and directly related to political change or not. Perceive the life that you choose to lead as having an impact, as having a contribution to the flow of ideas in society, and not necessarily being less of a service to the public because you're not obviously and directly trying to bring about political change. You can be indirectly and not obviously, but without any less meaning or any less impact, contributing to that. Has any of you ever heard of the app Uber? It's kind of a funny question to ask in Buies Creek because Uber's an app for hailing a taxi cab. And actually not quite a taxi cab, but somebody who's moving from point A to point B in a densely populated area, New York City, San Francisco. And they're driving their car along, and they have their app on their phone too. And somebody can say, I need a ride from point A to point B. And somebody else can say, I'm going from point A to point B, and I got a spare seat in my car. This app was created by kids your age. And another one was created to say, you know what, there's a lot of cars that are left in the parking lot at the airport at San Francisco, SFO. So let's suppose Lopez flies to San Francisco and instead of renting a car, wants to borrow somebody's car who has left their car in the parking lot. There's an app for connecting those two people, right? Do you think, wow, who would ever do that? Where's the trust, right? Well, the trust comes into play because there's verifications and there's reputations that come along with users with repeated play, with repeated interactions with each other. And the system works. It's like markets. They just do their thing and they work. But the system, this car borrowing system and this ride sharing system, it also butts up against the existing rules of the game. And so the taxi cab drivers and the limo drivers in San Francisco are saying, wait a second. And the car rental companies at SFO are saying, wait a second. But these kids are just putting together a business model and earning some profits. Right? They're just running a business, aren't they? No, they're not. They're contributing to the flow of ideas in society. And they're saying, this is legitimate. And this is actually creating way more value for people than just having a car rental companies, than just having the taxi cab companies. So I would say that that's just one more example of how to answer Professor Young's question.
Okay, last call. All right, please join me in thanking Professor Lopez. We have an open reception in the lobby for those of you who want to stick around and grab some food. And Dr. Lopez will be around to answer questions that you may have been too embarrassed to ask in public. So please enjoy.